In our last video, we saw how Games Workshop had become rather evil over the years, and part of this stemmed from what they consider to be an IP violation. And as we also mentioned, for a significant portion of the population, Warhammer is actually a video game series before it's a tabletop series. And that's not some hyperbolic statement meant to grab attention early on, it's likely a statistical truth at this point. While it's almost impossible to get accurate population figures from Games Workshop or their retailers, combing through internet forums and getting some data from my local board game sellers, we can make for a semi-informed guess. At the low end, we're looking at under 1 million who play the tabletop versions of Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar, and at the high end, we're going as potentially high as 5 million people. It's definitely not nothing, but for reference, both Total Warhammer 1 and 2 sold between 2 and 5 million copies. Dawn of War 1 sold just over 4 million copies before THQ folded, and it appears to have sold another 1.6 million copies since Sega took over. Dawn of War 2 again sold between 2 and 5 million copies. Space Marines sold yet another 2 to 5 million copies. Like any of these games individually reached a population that the entire tabletop manages combined. But keen-eyed viewers in our last video likely noticed that Games Workshop, despite this massive population playing video games from their IP, makes a laughably small amount of money from such an arrangement. So today we're here to take a look at how these incredibly disparate numbers can be true, how Games Workshop has handled video games across 3 separate eras, how to fix those numbers, and then lastly question whether Games Workshop is willing to put in the work to future-proof its income. Much like our last deep dive, this is going to be a longer video, so get comfortable and grab your biggest mug to fill up with milk. Alright, you all set? Neat, let's get started. Much like last time, we begin the story not by looking forward, but rather by looking backwards. Games Workshop's first interaction that most people are aware of with the video game space was actually a disastrous one. When the then small company of Blizzard requested rights to Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k, Games Workshop would decline the request. I mean, after all, how would video games ever help make a tabletop company more money? Well, with Blizzard having already started work on the games, they would not take this spurning with humility. Instead, the game which had already been started would simply eliminate the references to Warhammer Fantasy and release anyways, this time under Blizzard's own title, Warcraft. This human versus orcs real-time strategy didn't have much to fear. I mean, after all, neither humans nor orcs were Games Workshop inventions. Released in 1994, Warcraft was a minor sales success, selling 100,000 copies, which gave Blizzard enough breathing room to do some substantial changes, which was required for their other title, StarCraft. StarCraft, quite unlike Warcraft, would need quite a bit more work to swap. The Terrans were pretty direct copies of the Space Marines, the Protoss were very obviously the Eldar, and the Zerg were quite clearly the Tyranids. Throwing out the entire aesthetic all in one shot would have absolutely crippled them, so Blizzard was smart about it. Rather than changing out absolutely everything all in one shot, they changed bits and pieces. The Terrans would get rounded off and be given huge visors to visually separate them from the Space Marines. The Protoss would change the Eldar's armor shape to quite literally become the Protoss's body shape, and the Zerg would be modified just enough from the Tyranids of the era to become visually distinct. StarCraft, unlike Warcraft, would not be a minor sales success. Releasing 4 years later in 1998, StarCraft would sell over 100 times more copies at 11 million copies sold as of 2009. Even ignoring the massive capital that it brought in, StarCraft's insane sales success would also lead to further successes for Blizzard. StarCraft would release its first expansion, Brood War, a year later to another 8-figure sales count, and the next Warcraft release after StarCraft, Warcraft 3, would go on to sell 3 million copies. Diablo would also ride this success to become a mainstay name in the gaming space. Overall, in the span of just a few years, Blizzard had gone from a company that was almost bankrupted from Games Workshop's rejection to a company that was now worth substantially more than what Games Workshop even was. Ironically, while being denied the IP option was likely seemed like a death knell to them at the time, Blizzard's stock is now worth way more than Games Workshop, and that IP, or at least control of it, is likely the only reason. It's also the only reason that World of Warcraft and Hearthstone were as successful as they were when they released years later. But across the Atlantic, Games Workshop's then CEO Tom Kirby was fuming. This small company, this upstart, had the audacity to profit wildly at what he considered Games Workshop's ideas. So, as we mentioned in the previous video, this would lead him to do two massive internal changes at Games Workshop. They would sue anyone and anything that seemed even remotely reminiscent of their own IP in order to prevent another embarrassing miss. But they would also begin to coordinate with major players in the video game space to ride this billion-dollar wave to even greater profits. This leads us rather perfectly into Games Workshop's second era, the era wherein Games Workshop would coordinate itself with video game companies of its own choosing. And Games Workshop wouldn't be messing around here either. Their partnerships included some of the biggest names in the video game space. Electronic Arts, THQ, and Bandai Namco, among others, were all brought on to do video games of some form. And these partnerships definitely paid off in a manner. Blood Bowl, Dawn of War, and Space Marine, some of the games released in this era were not only outstanding sales successes, but also critical darlings as well. And while Games Workshop had done the odd video game release prior to this to minimal success, nothing had compared to these releases. Under Kirby's supervision, companies would be investigated and judged based upon their long-term potential profits. Gone were the small independents replaced by huge names that would handle the IPs exclusively unless they needed to be replaced. As much as I routinely speak ill of Tom Kirby's leadership, and justifiably so in my own opinion, he does deserve credit for this change alone. While Games Workshop's real success wouldn't come until years later, I sincerely believe that the only reason Games Workshop survived to see that success was thanks to the video game era keeping them growing enough to survive until then. You see, while Kirby was likely bringing in new fans to the series thanks to those video games, he was also doing a bang-up job driving old fans away thanks to horrendous business practices. As a result, the video games were less about profit generation and more about keeping the population of fans from shrinking. However, that lack of profit generation would become an issue. As we discussed in our previous deep dive, some of Kirby's other decisions would nearly bankrupt the company and leave it barely clinging to life. The potential revenue that Games Workshop was trading away was needed desperately, as the new fans weren't going to contribute enough income to replace the legions of old fans abandoning the company. The board, in their desperation, formally removed Kirby from his role, and his replacement would effectively do the exact opposite of Kirby when it came to video games in every possible way. Kevin Roundtree seemed hellbent on doing the precise opposite of Tom Kirby unilaterally. Whereas Kirby had prioritized profit to the detriment of staff and fans, Roundtree went through and addressed virtually every complaint he logically could. When Kirby had fought tooth and nail against the internet boon, Roundtree embraced it, seeing it as an expansion opportunity for the company. And where Kirby wanted to have a strictly controlled, exclusive relationship with specific publishers, Roundtree opened up the IP to virtually everyone, leading us into our third and current era. Some fans love this era, some fans hate it, but what it certainly has been is an interesting case study. Extra Credits did a brilliant dive into why this somewhat hated strategy isn't actually all that bad of an idea, and I will link their video down below if you want to take a gander. But I think there's a lot more to the puzzle that Extra Credits didn't really consider, such as the fact that Games Workshop isn't a video game company. They're a miniatures company, and the fact that they are utterly reliant on their IP for those miniatures to work. Just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the old process involved Games Workshop seeking out a publisher who would be granted exclusive access to an entire IP. So in THQ's case, for example, the reason there was no other 40K game released between the years 2000 and 2012, outside of THQ's own releases, is because no one else was allowed to. So long as things were going well, this relationship would be maintained. But Roundtree's process was very noticeably different. First things first, Games Workshop would no longer seek out companies. Instead, they would make the IP available and have the other companies come to them. Second, no company would gain control of an entire IP. They would apply based upon not only the IP, whether that's Warhammer Fantasy, 40K, or Age of Sigmar, the setting within that IP, and then the genre of game. If there was a conflict with the current game on all three counts, the application would then be denied. So a game could share a base IP and even a genre, but if it was in a different setting, hey, no problem. Or it could be part of the same setting, such as the end times, but viewed through a different genre, and that too would be fine. Or the previous game could have simply been too long ago, and then permission would be granted just based upon the fact that the previous game wasn't really in conflict. Assuming approval was given, this would then become a test of sorts for the developer or publisher in question. If they released a substandard product, they would be denied the rights to the IP, any of the IPs, going forward, so the hiatus was conceivably on the developer or publisher to do their best work, in order to maintain the option to do a sequel. This relationship would appear to be mutually beneficial. Games Workshop takes a cut from the sales, so the better a game does, the better they do for themselves. And additionally, if a game sells extremely well, it also brings more attention to the IP, which doubles up on their benefits. And for the developer or publisher, the IP brings attention to the game in question. Focus Home Interactive and Fatshark virtually made a name for themselves based exclusively upon the Warhammer IP. This would, from outside observation, appear to have done wonders for Games Workshop. In 2019, 87% of their royalty profits came from PC and console releases, with an additional 7% coming from mobile games. And as we've mentioned previously, these profits have been steadily trending upwards by a non-compounding 30% year over year. On its own, this would be great growth, but there is a small asterisk on that statement. Royalties account for a paltry £16.8 million, compared to the £269.7 million from their miniatures, or to put it differently, 1/16 of the value. If the miniatures profits stopped growing tomorrow, it would take 50 years, half a century, for royalty profits to catch up at their current pace. Needless to say, this isn't a viable path forward, and much like what we predicted in the previous video, Warhammer Plus doesn't seem to be having the best go of it, so they somewhat need those royalties to go up, and in a rather dramatic fashion at that. Further compounding these issues, while the current system has brought us games like Vermintide, Blood Bowl, and Total Warhammer, it's also brought us absolute garbage like Snotling Fling, Realm War, and Lost Crusade. These awful releases actually hurt the value of the IP, which, as we've said, is Games Workshop's life support. Thus, while they make a little bit of money short-term, long-term they are effectively killing their own future. So if you're Games Workshop, what can you do to fix that? There's effectively three paths in front of Games Workshop, so let's hit them one at a time and run through the potential results, starting with the current model, giving everyone a shot. I don't discount that this has had some incredible successes. Total Warhammer 2 and Vermintide 2 were both specifically called out for the increase in royalties in 2018's financial report, and both were absolutely brilliant at bringing new fans into the setting, as both games were absolutely adored by the community and reviewers. Heck, I know firsthand there has been at least two of my own friends that I have personally introduced to Warhammer lore thanks to Total Warhammer. There's also the implication that such a system will naturally lead to better and better games thanks to the prove yourself aspect of the IP grants. The worst will naturally get filtered out through denials. Lastly, such a system is great at flooding the board with games. With so many companies working simultaneously, it is easy to have multiple releases in a single year, like Games Workshop has been doing these last few years. Honestly though, this is me playing devil's advocate. In truth, I think this system is already starting to show its cracks. I mentioned that I got two friends to get into the lore through Total Warhammer, and while that statement is true, I myself, among several of my other friends, were also brought into the lore thanks to a friend getting us to play Dawn of War back in the day, so that isn't unique to Roundtree's approach, it's merely unique to good games. Secondly, those garbage releases are beginning to dilute the value of the Warhammer name on a video game. There was a time where a video game launching with the Warhammer IP was an automatic day one purchase for me, among many other people. However, it eventually stopped being a day one purchase incentive, and nowadays it honestly feels like a warning sign, especially on the mobile market. For every good PC release, there is a complete cash grab release of a cell phone game. I can't remember ever finding a decent Warhammer cell phone game, and this isn't unique to just the mobile games either. There are several cash grab PC and console releases as well. But the third negative, and potentially the most interesting one to analyze, is what constitutes a good game? Is it the initial launch only? How the game eventually ends up? How profitable it is? How much it's appreciated by fans? How much it's appreciated by reviewers? Does it bring in any income to the tabletop? Among all of that, where is the line in the sand for any of those points? Now, this might seem like a pointless question to some of you, but to you I'd say we already have a brilliant example of why this is an important question that we don't have an answer to. Battlefleet Gothic Armada. We're going to do a little tiny bit of a history lesson on this one game here, well, two games I suppose, because they're going to be referenced twice more going forward. The first Battlefleet Gothic Armada game was released back in early 2016 and even promised the first two DLCs for free for early adopters. The game launched to some pretty great scores owing to an awesome ship editing system, cool fleet unlocking system for each race, and a cool campaign, as well as the fact that, again, they were offering the two free DLCs. It wasn't a perfect release by any stretch. The unlocking system made multiplayer obscenely unfair to new players. There was some pretty obvious balancing issues, and the roster was a little skinny, but still, the roadmap for the future looked really, really good. After half a year, the two promised DLCs were out, though with some outstanding concerns, the community was eager to hear about more. Tindalos, the developer, would tease some future content, show off things like Necron ships, and tell the community to just keep waiting, they would have news for them later. This dance around the truth would go on for over 2 years. Then it was revealed that they'd given up on the first Battlefleet Gothic and wouldn't be releasing any more content for it. Instead, they would be doing a sequel starting at the beginning of 2019. This had the community frustrated with the communication, but still, maybe a second chance was all that was needed in order to right the spaceship, so many fans still stuck around to see what would happen. Instead, Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 launched without ship customization, without fleet unlocks, without single-player options for 3/4 of the races, without early adopter rewards, and with even greater balance issues. And having learned precisely nothing from the first time they alienated their community, Tindalos went back to radio silence except for the odd teaser, and has remained that way ever since. Now, Games Workshop clearly had faith in them. Not only was the game still given a second chance, the game was even used to launch the Fall of Cadia plot element, which Tindalos was given early intel on. But still, the community had been burned by the same company twice now. Why? Understand, this is not to pick on Tindalos exclusively, but they're an extremely good example of why this inevitable strategy of giving everyone at least one chance and then secretly picking winners makes little sense to fans. Why did Tindalos get a sequel? Was it due to the first game's launch? Maybe. It wasn't a critical darling by any stretch, but it certainly wasn't hated either. It certainly wasn't due to post-launch support. Tindalos was terrible at that. It likely didn't come down to money, either for the tabletop or for the game, as Battlefleet Gothic Armada didn't sell crazy well, even compared to other games at the time, and Games Workshop had stopped producing the Battlefleet Gothic tabletop. And looping back to these same questions, does Tindalos get a third crack at the bat now? The launch was actually met with some tentative excitement, and initial reviews were positive before everything went to hell in a handbasket again. We have no idea though, thanks to Games Workshop making all its decisions internally without any sort of community input. We'll talk about them more later though, so bear that story in mind as we go forward. Another option still available to Games Workshop is to revert back to the Kirby method of handpicking companies to work with. While Kirby took it to the extreme of exclusivity arrangements, I don't think that needs to be the case. We can continue with giving companies their own little niche and working with multiple companies simultaneously. I mean, heck, this could even build on the work accidentally done by a Roundtree system. The companies that have already proven themselves competent now, such as Creative Assembly, Fat Shark, and Slytherin, could be given even more opportunities, while future companies could be hand-selected to a degree, ensuring that the bad entries could be more easily avoided. While the big publishers like EA would likely still love this, as they do a lot of licensed games for other IPs to great success, I think it would actually be better to look at non-AAA developers. Imagine Chris Taylor, of the Supreme Commander fame, handling a take on a game in the epic scale, or just picture Sega doing an Orcish kart racer from the same studio that did Sonic All-Stars Racing. Or heck, let's go back and look at our Battlefleet Gothic example once more. Battlefleet Gothic 2 has the elements of a great game. Not unlike Total Warhammer, it combines a real-time tactics game paired up to a turn-based strategic layer. Now I should specify, they are a country mile apart in terms of complexity. Total Warhammer system is more complex in every possible way, but still, the elements are there. There is another game that featured spaceships in a large strategic layer, and one that is almost universally loved in comparison, Sins of a Solar Empire. I am definitely not the first person to think of this either, as there was not one but two separate Warhammer 40k mods for the game that unfortunately got killed shortly before Battlefleet Gothic's announcement. Sins of a Solar Empire has a lot of what Battlefleet Gothic 2 was trying to accomplish. Massive fleets, incredibly in-depth strategic elements, tons of gameplay options, a long-time player base. Basically, much of what Tindalos tried to pull off, Ironclad has already pulled off over a decade ago. The games are not a perfect one-to-one, obviously. Battlefleet is much more in-depth on the tactical side, whereas Sins has a much larger focus on strategy. Battlefleet is turn-based on the campaign map, whereas Sins stays real-time throughout. Battlefleet is aimed exclusively at combat, whereas Sins wants you to find your own win conditions. But still, there's a lot more similarities than there are differences. And as we've said, I clearly wasn't the only one who realized Ironclad Games had laid down the groundwork for a brilliant Battlefleet Gothic game. So why not hand Ironclad the keys to the kingdom? Simple, because Games Workshop doesn't seek out competent developers these days. They simply hope that those developers show up and ask for the IP. While Kirby's system promotes excellent quality among the games, it does suffer from a single glaring flaw compared to Roundtree's system, however: quantity. When THQ had the reins of Warhammer 40k, we were getting one 40k game per year. Under Roundtree's Everyone Gets a Shot system, we are now up to 5 40k games a year on average. I don't need to tell all of you that quintupling the amount of games released will very obviously result in more royalty payments, and sure enough, that's exactly what we see. While they haven't increased linearly with the amount of games released, it doesn't matter. They still increased dramatically enough over the era where individual publishers were picked. But I mentioned in the previous video that there's actually a third and better option on the table. Games Workshop has, or at the very least had, the capital to start their own development team. Instead of them simply scraping a few percent of the profits of a game, they could enjoy the entirety of the profits in such a system. And before anyone rushes in to comment and say this would be something that Games Workshop has no experience in, they actually do. Games Workshop originally did development of their own games before they ever contracted out the work, from 1983 to 1985. There's a weird little history lesson for you all. Now, of course, obviously there's some risk here, unlike with the other two ideas. In taking on development themselves, they have to directly fund the game themselves, so if it bombs, that's money directly out of their pocket. And with the budgets of modern games, that is not an insubstantial amount of money. We're now in an era where 9 figures for AAA games are commonplace, and even second-tier budgets are still deep into the tens of millions of dollars. However, I would also argue that the benefits make a lot of sense relative to the risk. First things first, money. As we've said, Games Workshop pulls in a laughably small amount of money from licensing. Even a single second-tier release would easily meet that amount, such as, the 350,000 units that Battlefleet Gothic sold. And that's assuming only a single release per year, and that they outright replace the contracted games with such a system. But there too, we see another strength. They don't need to replace their current systems with the in-house development, they can simply add it on. Such a system could be used alongside the contracted games, while Games Workshop dips its toes into the water. Let Vermintide and Total Warhammer handle things at the top end of the scale, while Games Workshop could get started with a smaller scale game, like another Battlefleet Gothic. As they find their footing and get better, they could eventually move up and do a new Dawn of War replacement, and keep working their way up the scales until they are large enough to handle most, if not all, projects in-house. This would definitely help future-proof their company. As was mentioned in our previous deep dive, Games Workshop's future is far from certain in spite of their extremely high current valuation. Despite the considerable outlay streaming services require, they tend not to provide any revenue, at least not for a long time, and their manufacturing element, their primary income source, is currently being threatened by 3D printing. They need something concrete to keep them going into the future, and video games are an industry that sees constant growth. But while money is obvious, there are some hidden strengths, such as the fact that they're already putting in the work to create assets. Games Workshop puts in a ton of effort into designing the 3D models for the miniatures, and that's the last time they ever use them. They'll get created once, turned into a mold, and then that's finished. However, a high-quality 3D model also provides great use as an asset for video games as well, which allows them to minimize their labor costs by working multiple industries from one effort. But as helpful as that is, a much more important tie-in would be with Warhammer Plus. Many companies are trying to move to games as a service, but it's a difficult ask in a world where there's already 1,000,001 subscriptions to manage. Games Workshop, in comparison, would be in the unique position to tie the games into Warhammer Plus, or provide bonuses from having Warhammer Plus, allowing them to artificially boost the value of their currently very hard-to-market service. Streaming services struggle when aiming for a global audience, but one aiming for an incredibly narrow niche of the population is almost assuredly doomed. But a streaming service that ties into video games that a lot of people like, well, that swings back round now into being a global market again. Even I would look at paying for a streaming service that gave me a decent strategy game once per year, or free DLCs for having it on one of my favorite games, or anything else along those lines. Throughout this video, we've taken a look at the history of Games Workshop's relationship with video games and looked at 3 major methods of handling them. Pick companies to work with, have companies come to them, or simply do it themselves. So, what's the best path forward? Well, first, I need to clarify something. By the best path forward, I am referring exclusively to Games Workshop as a company. All of us gamers actually mean nothing to them apart from as potential revenue streams, so our input means nothing outside of voting with our wallets. Frustrating us with a litany of cell phone games means nothing if we still financially reward them for doing so. It would still be a net positive for Games Workshop. So then, by that metric, going by what we've seen, the best option for Games Workshop is literally all of them, together. They each individually have their own issues. Picking companies is a slow system, giving everyone a shot erodes the value of the brand, and doing it themselves is a huge financial risk. But each of them cover each other's weaknesses. Taking time to pick certain companies ensures you've always got a high quality series on the go, such as a Total Warhammer, a Vermintide, or a Dawn of War, which maintains the value of the IP and provides huge awareness to the lore, potentially expanding the brand. Giving companies a shot becomes easier to manage when you can be a bit more choosy and the failures don't hurt as bad with huge releases to cover the sting, and even provide your own studios with sequel opportunities if those games fail. And the risk associated with designing your own games is mitigated when you have stable, high-quality releases and smaller releases to maintain ongoing revenue streams. That system would likely look like the following. The big releases that Games Workshop individually picked out in the past would likely be advertised on Warhammer Plus and on their YouTube channel, with the former also providing some sort of incentive, like a Day 1 launch DLC. Such a system would also incentivize Warhammer Plus subscribers to pick up the game, and hardcore fans of the game to pick up Warhammer Plus, providing a positive feedback loop. These big third-party releases would represent the AAA element of Games Workshop's releases. AAA in the sense of scale and quality, not necessarily anything else, meaning they would be responsible for providing a stable core to the video game division. Remember, of the 10 games released for Games Workshop in 2018, Vermintide 2 and 2017's Total Warhammer 2 were responsible for the majority of it, all on their own. The big names are going to be the base from which all the other income streams are allowed to take risks from. The companies that seek out Games Workshop of their own volition wouldn't be mentioned across Games Workshop stuff, at least not at first. By leaving the smaller indie scale games to sink or swim, Games Workshop could simply sweep failures underneath the rug with precious little fanfare, and even potentially use the series themselves for sequels down the road if the base game was a good enough idea that simply failed due to developer issues. Those that managed to carve out a name for themselves could start simply getting involved with Games Workshop events. Picture a Skulls for the Scroll Throne event and you're on the right track. Perhaps a small DLC bonus of some sort or another could be given away on Warhammer Plus, again rewarding the developers who truly knuckled down and made something great. As mentioned, these would be the smallest scale of games, down towards the indie side of the scale, which makes them a volatile source of expansion. Many would fail outright, but those that succeed would provide comparatively high growth opportunities for the brand. Now, this isn't to say that big publishers like Sega would be prevented from asking for their own games, but rather, in such a system, Games Workshop would have already logically asked them to do a game anyways. Games Workshop's own releases would fall in between those two extremes, being more of a AA release. These would be proudly displayed across their own subscription service and YouTube page, as well as having strong bonuses from the former. Discounts, or even full-on giveaways, exclusive DLCs, and event tie-ins would be standard practice here. Like the AAA releases, this provides a positive valuation for both Warhammer Plus and the video game that they're releasing, which is only amplified even further compared to the others, and at a negligible cost to Games Workshop in this instance also compared to the others. The purpose of in-house games are manifold. As we've said, they naturally promote the value and interest of Warhammer Plus subscription by their very nature, which would help further stabilize Games Workshop's income streams. 2, they provide a shelter in between potentially uncommon AAA releases and full-on indie titles, meaning Games Workshop always has a reason for gamers to be flocking to the IP. And lastly, while it's the most volatile out of all income streams, they are also undoubtedly one of the most lucrative, potentially allowing this particular branch to scale up in the future, providing even more growth in income. Now, given such information, what are the chances we would see such a change? Well, slim to none. You see, while investors do love growth, they are ironically opposed to change. Kirby was employed as CEO for 3 decades, yet effectively never raised its value during his entire tenure. Because most investors seem to fear volatility in a stock, in spite of the fact that volatility is the reason that they can make money from it. And again, it took 3 decades and almost completely torpedoing the entire company for investors to be willing to demand a change there. What do you think the chances are for the majority of investors to suddenly demand a rather sizable shakeup in Games Workshop's current business practices, especially given the consistently large growth over the last 4 years? I'm dubious we'll see a change at all from Games Workshop until they're already in trouble and many of these ideas will no longer help. If and when Warhammer Plus fails, the service won't be able to be pivoted into a stable income stream and a growth source. When the IP is too watered down from too many substandard video games, the AAA market will no longer be interested in cutting deals, cutting off the core income required to make the other 2 ideas future-proofed. And when the miniature sales are usurped from 3D printing, there won't be enough spare capital required to start their own studio, taking that out as an option as well. The investors either need to change things while they're still riding high, or risk having all their options taken away when they need those things the most. And as we've said, investors rarely welcome change, especially when things are good. Now, that's going to wrap up this deep dive, and I'm going to conclude this video with a question to the community. Let me know if you prefer these less common but more intense, lengthier videos, or if you would prefer a return to the shorter but more frequent videos from before. These long ones are a lot of work, so basically tell me whether you think they're worth the effort or not. As always though, I want to thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.